February 14, 1945. The air inside the Boeing aircraft assembly plant in Renton, Washington, carried the metallic tang of riveted aluminum and machine oil. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting white glare across endless rows of B-29 Superfortress fuselages in various states of completion. The concrete floor vibrated with the rhythm of pneumatic hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the orchestrated chaos of American industrial might. And then, at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, a bell rang. Not the shrill alarm of danger, not the urgent call to action, but a gentle chime that echoed through the cavernous space. Across the factory floor, thousands of women in coveralls and headscarves stopped their work. They set down their tools, stepped away from their stations, and walked toward break rooms where coffee waited in industrial personators and doughnuts sat arranged on metal trays. For 15 minutes, mandated by law and enforced by management, they would rest. To the American women who had grown accustomed to this rhythm over 3 years of wartime production, it was routine. But to the 37 Japanese women who had arrived at this facility just weeks earlier, refugees, defectors, wives of interned diplomats given work assignments as part of complex State Department arrangements, the bell represented something incomprehensible. One of them, a woman named Fumiko Nakamura, stood frozen at her riveting station, her hand still gripping the pneumatic hammer, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She looked to her left, then her right, watching the American women file away, and whispered to her countrymen in Japanese a question that would echo through subsequent State Department reports and classified sociological studies. "You let us rest?" The question carried within it an entire universe of disbelief, conditioned by decades of industrial ideology that had shaped the Japanese understanding of labor, duty, and human worth. To comprehend the shock that reverberated through these women as they encountered American factory conditions required understanding the world they had emerged from, a world where rest was not a right but a form of moral weakness, where the concept of mandated breaks contradicted every principle they had been taught about sacrifice, endurance, and national service. In Japan, particularly during the wartime mobilization that had intensified after Pearl Harbor, industrial labor had been reimagined as a spiritual exercise, an extension of the Bushido code that governed military conduct. Women working in munitions factories, aircraft plants, and textile mills operated under a system called Sanpo, the Industrial Patriotic Movement, which treated factory work as a form of holy service to the emperor. The very idea of stopping production for personal comfort would have been considered an act of betrayal, a selfish indulgence that weakened the collective will. Records from the Nakajima Aircraft Company, one of Japan's largest military contractors, revealed production schedules that ran 12 to 16 hours daily, 7 days a week, with rest breaks limited to brief moments for meals consumed standing at workstations. Women who fainted from exhaustion were carried to side areas, revived with cold water, and returned to their positions. The concept of a break room did not exist in Japanese wartime industrial vocabulary. The contrast between these two industrial philosophies represented more than mere differences in labor management. They embodied fundamentally divergent conceptions of human value, national strength, and the relationship between individual welfare and collective purpose. The Japanese model, intensified under wartime mobilization but rooted in cultural traditions stretching back centuries, viewed hardship as purifying. Suffering in service to the nation was not something to be minimized, but rather maximized as proof of dedication. The military code of Bushido, which had once applied only to samurai warriors, had been democratized during the Meiji period and further expanded during the Showa era to encompass all Japanese citizens, particularly during wartime. Every person became a soldier in spirit, every factory a battlefield, every moment of discomfort a medal of honor earned in the invisible war of production. This ideology was reinforced through constant propaganda, school curricula, workplace indoctrination sessions called Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education, where workers gathered before shifts to recite pledges, sing patriotic songs, and remind themselves that their bodies were not their own but instruments of imperial will. Rest, in this framework, was not regenerative but corrosive. It softened the spirit, weakened resolve, and created space for doubt to enter the mind. A 1943 directive from the Ministry of Munitions stated explicitly that comfort is the enemy of victory, and instructed factory managers to eliminate all unnecessary amenities that might soften the fighting spirit of production warriors. The American approach could not have been more different, though the differences were not immediately apparent to outside observers. To Japanese intelligence analysts studying American industry from afar, the high productivity of American factories seemed to confirm that Americans, despite their reputation for softness and luxury, could mobilize effectively when necessary. What they failed to understand, what no amount of intelligence gathering could reveal without direct experience, was that American productivity was not achieved despite worker welfare measures but because of them. The 15-minute breaks mandated in Boeing's Renton facility were not acts of kindness or weakness. They were calculated applications of industrial psychology and efficiency science. Studies conducted by the War Production Board and the Department of Labor had demonstrated conclusively that workers who received regular rest breaks were more productive per hour, made fewer errors, suffered fewer accidents, and maintained consistent output over longer periods. The breaks were not concessions to human frailty but investments in human capacity. This represented a philosophical revolution in industrial thinking, one that had been developing in America since the early 20th century but had accelerated dramatically under wartime pressure. The American model proposed something radical, that treating workers as valuable assets rather than expendable resources actually increased production. That health, morale, and efficiency were not opposing forces but complementary elements of an integrated system. That abundance and strength were not contradictions but mutually reinforcing realities. When Fumiko Nakamura and her fellow Japanese women first entered the Boeing facility, they had expected hell. Not metaphorical hell, but a literal inferno of suffering that would match or exceed what they had experienced in Japanese factories. They had been briefed, minimally, by State Department liaisons who explained that they would be working in aircraft production, that conditions would be different from what they knew, that they should observe American workplace customs. But nothing in these briefings had prepared them for the sensory assault of American industrial abundance. The factory itself was vast beyond comprehension, over 1 million square feet of workspace, large enough to hold dozens of Japanese factories within its walls. The lighting was so bright it seemed like perpetual daylight, powered by electricity that never flickered or failed. The tools were new, maintained, replaced when worn rather than repaired until they disintegrated. The safety equipment, goggles, gloves, protective aprons, was provided without cost and in sufficient quantity that each worker received her own set rather than sharing. But even these material realities paled beside the cultural shock of that first break bell. When it rang, Fumiko had assumed it signaled an emergency, a bomb drill, perhaps an attack. She had frozen in place, waiting for instructions, expecting to be herded toward shelters. Instead, she watched American women simply stop. They set down tools worth more than a month's wages in Japan without locking them away. They walked, not ran, toward rooms Fumiko had not previously noticed. And there, in those break rooms, she witnessed something that would haunt her reports to State Department debriefers for months afterward: abundance without apology. The break rooms at Boeing's Renton facility were not luxurious by American standards. They were utilitarian spaces with long tables, metal folding chairs, basic plumbing, and commercial coffee makers. But to women conditioned by Japanese wartime scarcity, they represented impossible luxury. The coffee was real coffee, not the chicory substitute or burnt barley tea that Japanese workers received. The doughnuts, this concept alone required explanation, were made with white sugar and wheat flour, ingredients that had been rationed in Japan to the point of near disappearance. They were free, provided by the company, replaced daily. Workers could eat as many as they wanted. No one counted. No one monitored. No one judged. This casual abundance, this assumption of plenty, violated every principle of wartime discipline Fumiko had internalized. In Japan, every grain of rice was sacred, every drop of tea measured, every calorie accounted for and justified. Waste was not merely impractical but immoral, a betrayal of soldiers fighting with empty stomachs, of civilians surviving on increasingly meager rations. Yet here, American women threw away half-eaten doughnuts, poured out unfinished coffee, treated food with a carelessness that seemed almost violent in its indifference to scarcity. The first time Fumiko accepted a doughnut from the tray, she held it in both hands like a religious offering, unable to bite into it. An American supervisor, a woman named Margaret who had been assigned to help integrate the Japanese workers, noticed her hesitation. "Go on, honey," Margaret said, her voice friendly, assuming the problem was unfamiliarity with the food. "They're fresh this morning. Bakery delivers every day." The kindness in her voice, the assumption that Fumiko's hesitation was about taste preference rather than moral paralysis, somehow made the moment more overwhelming. Fumiko took a small bite, and the sweetness of real sugar flooded her mouth, a taste she had not experienced in over 2 years. And then, inexplicably, she began to cry. This moment, a Japanese woman weeping over a donut in a Boeing break room while fluorescent lights hummed overhead and American women chatted around her, contained within it the entire ideological conflict of the Pacific War in microcosm. What the Japanese women had expected to encounter in American factories was a mirror of their own experience, perhaps slightly softened by American weakness, but fundamentally familiar. They expected to see workers driven by necessity, suffering through deprivation, sustained by propaganda and duty. They expected a wartime economy that looked like war, harsh, demanding, purified by sacrifice. Instead, they found something far more disturbing, a system that produced instruments of war while maintaining conditions of peace. The B-29 superfortresses being assembled around them were the most sophisticated weapons in human history to that point, aircraft capable of carrying 10-ton bomb loads across thousands of miles to incinerate Japanese cities. Yet the women building these machines of destruction were treated not as production warriors but as valued employees entitled to rest, safety, fair compensation, and, most incomprehensibly, consideration of their well-being as an end in itself rather than merely a means to production. This contradiction was not a failure of American ideology but its ultimate expression. The breaks were not a concession extracted through labor struggle, though American unions had certainly fought for worker rights. They were a demonstration of surplus, a message encoded in every coffee cup and donut. We are so powerful that we can afford to rest. We are so abundant that we waste. We are so confident in our production capacity that we mandate inefficiency, knowing we will still outproduce you. The Japanese military strategy had been premised on a calculation about American weakness, that a soft, luxury-addicted society could not sustain the hardships of total war, that American workers would crumble under pressure, that American industry would falter when tested. Every aspect of Japanese wartime propaganda reinforced this narrative. Americans were portrayed as spiritually weak, made soft by materialism, incapable of true sacrifice. The mandatory breaks, the doughnuts, the coffee, these were supposed to be evidence of American decadence. Instead, they were evidence of American capacity. The transformation in understanding that occurred among the Japanese women working at Boeing did not happen instantly. It unfolded over weeks and months as they accumulated experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how societies function under pressure. The 15-minute breaks occurred twice per shift, mid-morning and mid-afternoon, but they were not the only time when work stopped. There was a full hour for lunch, during which workers could leave the facility, eat in the cafeteria, or bring food from home. There were medical facilities staffed with nurses who treated injuries immediately, not hours later when shifts ended. There were safety protocols that halted production when violations occurred, prioritizing worker welfare over output targets. There were supervisors who asked if workers were tired, who suggested rotating tasks to prevent repetitive strain, who treated human limitation not as moral failure but as engineering constraint to be worked around. Each of these practices, individually minor, accumulated into a comprehensive revelation. American strength was not despite its consideration of human welfare but because of it. The productivity numbers confirmed this in ways that could not be denied. The Renton facility where Fumiko worked produced one completed B-29 every 63 hours at peak efficiency, a rate that Japanese intelligence analysts, reading reports from neutral observers, initially dismissed as impossible propaganda. Surely no factory could achieve such output while simultaneously wasting time on breaks, safety protocols, and worker comfort. The numbers had to be fabricated. But they were not fabricated. They were, if anything, conservative. The Boeing facility was one of several producing B-29s, and the combined output of American heavy bomber production exceeded the entire Japanese aircraft industry's total output across all categories. And this achievement was accomplished by a workforce that included millions of women who had never worked in factories before 1941, who received training measured in weeks rather than years, who were treated not as expendable production warriors but as citizens temporarily contributing to a national effort. The symbolic weight of those mandatory breaks became a focal point in the letters and diaries kept by Japanese women workers, documents that would later be collected by State Department researchers studying cultural integration and wartime labor psychology. One woman, identified in archives only as Worker KM from Hiroshima Prefecture, wrote in a letter that was intercepted and translated, "Today I committed a sin against the Emperor. I sat down while there was still work to be done. An American woman told me I must sit, that it was the rule, that I would be in trouble if I continued working through the break time. I tried to explain that I did not need rest, that my body was strong enough to continue, that stopping was wasteful. She laughed, not cruelly, but as if I had told a joke, and said, 'Honey, the company doesn't own you. The break is yours. Take it.' I did not understand her words then. I am not certain I understand them now. But I sat, and I drank coffee that was sweeter than any tea I have tasted in Japan, and I felt the Emperor's eyes upon me in judgment. Yet the American women around me showed no shame. They spoke of their children, their husbands overseas, their plans for after the war. They spoke as if the war would end, as if life existed beyond service. I do not know what to think anymore. I do not know if I am becoming weak or if I never understood what strength was." This letter, with its anguished confusion and dawning recognition, captured the psychological transformation that occurred when ideological certainty encountered empirical reality. The breaks were not making the Japanese women weak. They were demonstrating that Japanese definitions of strength had been constructed on false premises. The American approach to industrial production during World War II represented the culmination of decades of evolving labor philosophy, efficiency science, and pragmatic social reform. It was not born from pure idealism but from a hard-headed recognition that sustainable production required sustainable workers. The roots of this philosophy stretched back to Frederick Winslow Taylor's time-motion studies in the early 20th century, which attempted to scientifically optimize worker efficiency. But Taylor's early work had focused primarily on extracting maximum output through process optimization, treating workers as components in a machine. The evolution came through subsequent generations of industrial psychologists, labor economists, and progressive reformers who recognized that human beings were not machines and that treating them as such was not only morally problematic but economically inefficient. The breakthrough insight was recognizing that worker productivity was not a simple input-output equation but a complex system involving physical capacity, mental state, social dynamics, and long-term sustainability. A worker pushed to absolute limits might produce more in a single hour but would produce less over a day, a week, a month. A worker denied rest would make more errors, suffer more accidents, require more supervision, and eventually collapse. The breaks were not charity. They were system optimization. The War Production Board, established in 1942 to coordinate American industrial mobilization, made this understanding central to its productivity guidelines. Studies commissioned by the board demonstrated that factories implementing mandatory rest breaks, limiting shift lengths to reasonable hours, and providing adequate nutrition and medical care consistently outperformed factories that attempted to maximize hours worked. The data was unambiguous. Yet this data contradicted the cultural assumptions of every major power except the United States. The Soviet Union, Britain, Germany, and Japan all structured their wartime labor systems around extended hours and minimized breaks, assuming that total mobilization required total commitment. Only America, with its combination of industrial capacity, scientific management, and democratic culture, implemented the counterintuitive insight that rest increased production. The doughnuts became, for the Japanese women at Boeing, a symbol that carried meaning far beyond their material reality. In Japanese wartime culture, sweets had become almost mythical, remembered from childhood, mentioned in letters from soldiers as symbols of the peaceful world they were fighting to restore, hoarded in tiny portions when available. Sugar had been rationed in Japan since 1940, with civilian allocations reduced repeatedly as military demands increased and supply lines contracted. By 1945, the average Japanese civilian consumed less sugar in a month than the Boeing break room provided in a single day. The abundance of doughnuts, replenished daily without ceremony or scarcity, represented something more profound than mere caloric provision. It represented an economic system so productive that it could afford to be wasteful, a society so confident in its agricultural and industrial base that it could feed factory workers dessert during work hours. The symbolism would have been lost on most American workers, who had grown up in a culture of relative abundance even during the Depression years. But to the Japanese women, each doughnut was a small miracle and a larger indictment. If America could provide such abundance to ordinary workers during wartime, what had they been told about American weakness? If American factories could maintain such conditions while outproducing Japan's entire industrial base, what did that say about Japanese propaganda claims of spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantage? The cognitive dissonance created by these contradictions could not be easily resolved. Some women attempted to maintain their ideological framework by recontextualizing what they observed. Perhaps American abundance was temporary, unsustainable, a final burst before collapse. Perhaps the breaks were a sign of American laziness that would eventually manifest in inferior products. Perhaps the kindness of American supervisors was manipulation, designed to extract loyalty through false generosity. But these rationalizations became harder to maintain as weeks became months and the observable reality remained consistent. The breaks continued. The doughnuts appeared. The B-29s rolled off the production line with mechanical precision. And the war news, though censored and limited, carried rumors that these comfortable, well-rested women were producing the aircraft that were burning Japanese cities. The concept of mandatory rest contained within it an implicit philosophy of human rights that was fundamentally foreign to Japanese wartime ideology. In the Japanese framework, rights were not inherent to individuals but granted conditionally by the state in recognition of service and status. The emperor bestowed rights. He did not recognize them as pre-existing. The individual existed to serve the collective, and the collective's needs, as defined by military and political leadership, superseded any personal claim to comfort, rest, or autonomy. This was not considered oppressive but natural, the proper order of society. The American framework, though imperfectly realized and contradicted by the brutal realities of racial segregation and inequality, nonetheless enshrined a different principle, that individuals possessed inherent worth and rights that preceded and superseded state authority. The breaks were not gifts from benevolent management but contractual obligations, legally mandated and practically enforced. Workers were entitled to rest not because they had earned it through exceptional service but because they were human beings whose welfare mattered regardless of their productivity. This principle extended beyond breaks into every aspect of the factory's operation. The safety equipment, The medical facilities, the training programs, the grievance procedures, all reflected an assumption that workers were not expendable resources but valuable individuals whose loss or injury represented genuine costs beyond mere replacement expenses. The Japanese women struggling to understand this framework often focused on its material manifestations, the coffee, the doughnuts, the comfortable break rooms, because these were tangible, observable, undeniable. But the deeper transformation occurred as they began to internalize the philosophical premises underlying these material conditions. One woman, in a debriefing session recorded in State Department archives, tried to explain her confusion to an American interviewer. In Japan, we are taught that suffering makes us strong, that endurance is virtue, that to accept comfort is to become weak. But here, I see comfort and strength together. I see rest and productivity together. I see care for workers and production of weapons together. In Japan, these things are opposites. Here they are the same thing. I do not have words in English. It is like you have made suffering unnecessary, and I was taught that suffering was necessary. So now I do not know what is true. The historical evidence documenting the experiences of Japanese women in American wartime factories remained largely classified until the 1970s, when changing attitudes toward wartime history and Freedom of Information Act requests began to pry open State Department archives. The documents revealed a sophisticated program of cultural observation and analysis, as American officials recognized that these women represented a unique intelligence asset, not for military secrets but for understanding the psychological gap between Japanese and American conceptions of society, work, and human value. Teams of sociologists, anthropologists, and psychologists conducted regular interviews with the Japanese workers, documenting their reactions, tracking their adaptation, and analyzing the patterns of transformation that occurred as exposure to American norms challenged their internalized assumptions. One particularly striking report, dated August 1945 and authored by Dr. Ruth Benedict, who would later write The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, noted, "The subjects consistently express shock not at the harshness of American factory conditions but at their leniency. They interpret mandatory rest breaks as evidence of either American weakness or incomprehensible abundance. When informed that such breaks are legally required and enforced by government regulation, subjects struggle to reconcile this with their understanding of wartime mobilization. The concept that government would mandate rest rather than maximum effort during total war contradicts fundamental assumptions about state authority and national crisis. Over time, however, subjects begin to recognize that American productivity exceeds Japanese productivity despite, or because of, these lenient conditions. This recognition produces cognitive dissonance that resolves through gradual ideological transformation rather than rejection of observable evidence. Benedict's report identified the mandatory breaks as the single most significant factor in this transformation, not because of their material impact but because of their symbolic resonance. The breaks represented, in compressed form, the entire American proposition about the relationship between individual welfare and collective strength. The transformation was not uniform or complete. Some Japanese women remained ideologically resistant, interpreting American conditions through frameworks that preserved their existing beliefs. Others underwent rapid conversion, embracing American norms with the fervor of believers encountering revelation. Most occupied a confused middle ground, simultaneously acknowledging the empirical reality of American productivity and abundance while struggling to reconcile it with deeply ingrained cultural values. The war's end in August 1945 complicated these transformations further, as the women faced the prospect of returning to a devastated Japan where the ideological certainties they had begun to question would be even more thoroughly shattered by total defeat. Yet certain patterns remained consistent across individual variations. Nearly all the Japanese women reported that the mandatory breaks had been their first significant encounter with American difference, the moment when they recognized that the cultural gap was not merely about material resources but about fundamental philosophy. Nearly all identified coffee or donuts or some aspect of break room abundance as symbolic markers of this difference. And nearly all struggled to articulate, even in their native language, the conceptual framework that would explain why rest increased productivity, why worker welfare enhanced efficiency, why abundance and strength were not contradictions. These women had been raised in a culture that valorized scarcity, that treated suffering as purifying, that understood strength as the capacity to endure deprivation. The American system proposed something different. That strength was the capacity to create abundance, that productivity was maximized not by pushing human limits but by respecting them, that a society's power was measured not by its ability to make citizens suffer but by its ability to spare them from suffering while still achieving objectives. This was not merely a different approach to factory management. It was a different conception of what civilization was for. The Boeing plant in Renton continued operating at peak capacity through the final months of the war, producing the B-29s that would carry conventional and nuclear payloads to Japanese cities. The women building these aircraft, American and Japanese working side by early 1945, continued taking their mandated breaks, drinking their coffee, eating their donuts, engaging in conversations that mixed production talk with personal stories. The Japanese women, gradually integrating into work rhythms that had seemed incomprehensible in February, found themselves defending the brake system when new arrivals expressed the same shock they had felt months earlier. This role reversal, becoming ambassadors for American labor practices to their own countrymen, marked a subtle but significant ideological shift. They had not abandoned their cultural identity or national loyalty, but they had absorbed an alternative model of social organization that could not be unknown once recognized. The evidence of this transformation appeared in small moments documented in supervisory reports and personal letters. A Japanese woman explaining to a new arrival that the brakes are not weakness, they are system, using English vocabulary she had learned specifically to articulate this concept. Another woman requesting permission to take home leftover donuts not for herself but to share with other Japanese families in her internment-adjacent housing, wanting them to taste the impossible sweetness that had come to symbolize American capacity. A group of Japanese workers volunteering to work overtime, not through compulsion but genuine choice, to meet production deadlines, then insisting that their overtime pay be calculated correctly according to American labor law rather than accepting straight-time compensation as would have been expected in Japan. These moments reflected not wholesale adoption of American values but recognition that alternative systems could function, that efficiency and compassion were not mutually exclusive, that strength could manifest through abundance rather than only through deprivation. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Boeing plant in Renton, which had produced over 1,100 B-29 superfortresses during the war years, began transitioning toward peacetime production. The Japanese women working in the facility faced uncertain futures. Some remained in the United States, beginning the complex process of building lives in the country they had been raised to consider the enemy. Others returned to Japan as part of repatriation programs, carrying with them memories of mandatory breaks and free donuts into a homeland that had been bombed into rubble. The symbolic resonance of their experience would echo through subsequent decades of Japanese industrial recovery and development. When Japanese manufacturers began rebuilding in the 1950s and 1960s, they studied American production methods with intensity born of defeat and determination to understand the source of American industrial supremacy. The insights they gained about quality control, efficiency systems, worker training, would eventually be refined into manufacturing philosophies that would challenge American industrial dominance by the 1980s. But embedded in this arc of recovery and competition was a quieter legacy. The recognition that worker welfare and productivity were not opposing forces but complementary elements of effective systems. Post-war Japanese labor law, written under American occupation but reflecting genuine Japanese adaptation, included provisions for rest breaks, maximum work hours, and workplace safety standards that would have been unthinkable under the wartime regime. The transformation was never complete or uncontested. Japanese work culture retained many elements of its intensive, commitment-focused approach, and the balance between productivity and worker welfare remained perpetually negotiated rather than permanently settled. But the women who had wept over doughnuts in Boeing break rooms carried forward a knowledge that could not be erased, that strength and abundance could coexist, that rest could increase rather than decrease output, that systems treating humans as valuable produced superior results to systems treating humans as expendable. The deeper truth embedded in those mandatory breaks transcended the specific context of wartime production. The breaks represented a fundamental insight about the relationship between freedom and power, between individual dignity and collective strength. The Japanese wartime system had been premised on a theory of mobilization that treated individual welfare as a resource to be consumed in pursuit of national objectives. Every comfort surrendered, every hour of rest sacrificed, every personal desire sublimated to collective need was understood as contributing to national power. The logic was intuitive, even seductive. Total commitment should produce total victory, and any reservation of individual welfare represented a weakening of collective resolve. The American system, almost accidentally, demonstrated the fallacy of this logic. By mandating breaks, by providing abundant food, by treating worker welfare as a production input rather than a production competitor, American industry achieved outputs that Japanese planners had calculated as theoretically impossible. The breaks were not subtracted from productivity, they multiplied it. The abundance was not wasteful consumption but investment in human capital. The consideration for worker well-being was not weakness but sophisticated understanding of human systems. This inversion of expected relationships, that consideration produced strength, that abundance enabled power, that freedom enhanced rather than compromised collective capability, represented the democratic proposition in its most practical form. Democracy was not merely a political system of voting and representation. It was a comprehensive social technology that recognized human dignity and individual welfare as sources of strength rather than obstacles to strength. The mandatory breaks in Boeing's Renton facility were democracy in action, not in the sense of elections or speeches, but in the sense of systems designed around the assumption that human well-being mattered intrinsically and that societies respecting this principle would outperform societies violating it. The Japanese women who experienced this revelation carried forward a knowledge that would ripple through subsequent history in ways impossible to fully trace but impossible to deny. Some became advocates for labor rights in post-war Japan, drawing on their American experience to argue for reforms. Others simply raised children with different assumptions about the relationship between work and rest, suffering and strength, individual dignity and collective purpose. The transformation was not revolutionary but evolutionary, not a sudden break with tradition but a gradual integration of alternative possibilities into cultural consciousness. The symbolic power of those break room doughnuts, their impossible sweetness, their casual abundance, their representation of a society so productive it could afford waste, remained vivid in memory even as material circumstances changed. Decades later, in interviews conducted by historians researching Japanese-American wartime interactions, elderly women who had worked at Boeing still spoke about the breaks with a mixture of bemusement and recognition. They had been shocked by rest. They had been transformed by abundance. They had learned that strength and compassion were not opposites but partners, that the most powerful societies were not those that drove their citizens hardest but those that enabled their citizens most fully. This was the lesson encoded in a simple bell ringing at 10 o'clock on a February morning in 1945, calling workers to rest not from compassion alone but from wisdom. The bell said, "You are valuable. Your well-being matters." This society is strong enough to care for its people even while at war. And in that simple message, repeated twice per shift for thousands of workers across hundreds of factories, lay the democratic promise that would ultimately prove more powerful than all the propaganda about sacrifice and spiritual strength that Japan could muster. The epilogue to this story is written not in archives but in the lived reality of modern industrial societies, in the labor standards that spread globally in the decades following World War II, in the recognition, still imperfect, still contested, but fundamentally established, that human dignity and economic productivity are not competing values but complementary principles. The Japanese women who asked, "You let us rest?" with voices full of shock and confusion had stumbled into the central insight of democratic civilization, that freedom is not the absence of collective purpose but its most powerful enabler, that abundance is not the enemy of strength but its foundation, that societies caring for their citizens outperform societies consuming their citizens. The break bell continues to ring, in factories and offices across the world, marking moments when human beings step back from production to simply exist as themselves, and in those moments the democratic promise renews itself, that you are more than your output, that your well-being matters beyond your utility, that rest is not weakness but wisdom. This is the truth that cannot be unlearned once recognized, the revelation that arrived with the taste of coffee and donuts in a Boeing break room on a February morning when the war still raged and the outcome remained uncertain, when Japanese women encountered American abundance and began the slow, difficult work of understanding that strength and compassion, freedom and power, individual dignity and collective achievement need not be enemies but can be, must be, and in the end always are, different expressions of the same fundamental truth, that human beings flourish when treated as valuable, and societies recognizing this simple fact will always, eventually, outcompete societies that do not.